Hello and welcome back, and today I want to show you guys how to install Windows Server 2016 and 2019 on your Synology NAS. Now, straight off the bat, it is worth highlighting that I am going to focus more on 2016 than anything else on this video, but it's worth highlighting that the tips I'm going to show you today will allow you to install pretty much any version of Windows Server onto a Synology NAS, as well as multiple different variations of Windows Virtual Machine. The reason I'm focusing on Windows Server today is a number of you already run businesses that involve the Windows Server platform. You've got an HP server or maybe some big scale snap server of some sort, and that server is running a copy of the Windows Server software. It's kind of like Windows 10 looking these days, and it's basically a graphical user interface to control a server that's more familiar to Windows desktop users. And this allows you to install Windows Server, either an existing version that you own or a brand new one, onto a Synology NAS. The second proviso to bear in mind is you will need to make sure you're using a Synology NAS with enough hardware. Now, at the base level, you're going to need at least a quad-core Celeron base Synology NAS and between 4 and 8 gig of memory. I do recommend going higher than that, but for today's video, we're going to utilize a DS1019 Plus, and that NAS features both a quad-core Intel Celeron-based processor, so it's in its 64-bit architecture processor, and it arrives with 8 gig of memory. So those are the specifications we're going to be utilizing today. Now, first thing you're going to need to do before you do anything else is to actually get a copy of Windows Server. Now, there's several ways you can do this. Maybe you've already purchased it and you've got a digital license or a USB license, or you've got an optical disc that you're going to need to use the Windows conversion tools to convert into a USB or digital ISO version. Alternatively, maybe you've already got a Windows Server and you've created and exported an image of that Windows Server. All of these tools are things that you can get on Microsoft's own website. The last option, and particularly those that want to just test if Windows Server will run okay on their system, is to get a brand new version of Microsoft's Windows Server 2016 or 19. If you head to the Windows evaluation area, you can get a whole list of server software that you can download. There's lots of different versions, all of them such as Windows Hyper-V or Microsoft Hyper-V and Windows vServer and more. You can get images and VDMK files ready to go. Now, I've already downloaded these, but if you choose to download one of these, such as Windows Server 2016, click Start the Evaluation, and from here it will invite you to select which kind of container you want the VM to be in. I recommend ISO for the sake of straightforward installation, but you can utilize Azure as you see fit. From there, click Continue, enter your details, and then after that, when you click Continue, you'll be able to download the 6 to 7 gig file that is the Windows Server installation. Now, when you've downloaded that to your local machine, you've got several options. One, you can upload it to the NAS directly via the user interface of DSM or a mapped network drive, or do what I did and stick it on an external USB stick, then connect that external USB stick to your NAS, and there are your ISO files. You can complete this installation utilizing it on the USB disk, but I recommend transferring it over to your own system, which is what I've done. I've created 2 folders here. For software, I've got the images of Windows Server in here, one for Windows Server 2016 and another for 2019. And then create a separate folder that you're going to utilize later on for the installation. I'm naming this one WSS. Now, the reason I'm using Windows Server 2016 for the bulk of this video is simply because Windows Server 2019 needs a little bit more hardware behind it. And although all the steps I'm going to show you today can be used on any of the copies of Windows Server, I want to make sure that I use one that's going to run at least usably within this NAS environment. So I've got our image there. So next we need to install the right Synology software. Go to the Package Center and look for an application called Synology Virtual Machine Manager, or Virtual Machine Manager for short. This application will allow you to create virtual environments within your Synology NAS. You can then choose to allocate some of the hardware resources from your CPU and memory, and then they will then be allocated to the virtual machine for your Windows Server environment. I've already installed the app, but if you were to click install here on your screen where it says open on mine, it will install the app quite quickly. From here we need to click open, or you can access the application on the list of applications there. The Virtual Machine Manager Setup Wizard will then go through step by step each of the checks it needs to make for your virtual machine. As you can see, I don't quite meet all of the criteria yet, but what we need to do is tick these off one by one, and particularly that virtual switch, because this will create a kind of virtual LAN port and network interface between this Windows Server setup and the NAS and the greater world. So from here we're going to click next and move forward. We're going to set up a virtual switch, and from here we're going to be able to set up our storage area. As you can see, the system is saying right now that I don't have a BTRFS storage volume for the cluster to live on. So we're going to create a BTRFS storage volume now. If you've already got one, you can skip this step. If you're not utilizing a BTRFS storage volume in order to engage this virtual machine, what you need to do is head over to the Storage Manager. Now, you should have available drives. If you don't and you've already created a RAID 1 environment, you may have difficulty with the rest of this installation, and I do recommend that you keep the virtual machines on a BTRFS and definitely a Synology supported volume. So from here, what we need to do is go down to our hard drives, and as you can see, I've got two drives that are currently the Seagate Ironwolf series of drives, those NAS drives that we talk about on the channel quite a lot, and they are in a RAID 1 configuration. But because I'm using ext4 and RAID 1 as opposed to SHR and BTRFS, they are not suitable for this virtual machine environment and the fast snapshot background activities that we need. So what I've done is installed an additional drive. Now, for today's video, and this Windows Server installation, I'm going to utilize this SSD. Now, a lot of you aren't going to be utilizing SSDs. You're probably going to be utilizing standard hard drives in a RAID environment. That's absolutely fine. But for the very best performance, I do recommend either utilization of SSD caching or installing this on an SSD directly. Moreover, I'm utilizing the Seagate Ironwolf NAS series of drives, the 110, which arrive with a bunch of performance benefit tools, as well as the ability to look into the background of your drive and find out more information about its health and its abilities. So we've got my drive there. So now I'm going to create a brand new storage pool utilizing that SSD. This is going to be a standard high flexibility drive, so we can add more drives later on, and it's going to be SHR. We click next. There's our SSD that's not been allocated. We click next again, and now it will initialize the drive. I recommend that you perform a drive check. Me personally, I'm going to skip it on this occasion to save you guys time, but I recommend always doing an integrity check on your drives. We're going to set this up, and this will happen very quickly because there's no RAID configuration. And once this is done, it's now said that before we can use the space on the storage pool, we have to create the volume, which makes sense. The storage pool is the total available capacity on the drives you've selected. The volume is an area of storage on that storage pool that can take up all the space, or you can create multiple volumes and containers if you so choose. If we click next, we can see the existing storage pool. We can select our the drive there that we've created, the SHR, and from there click next, and it will allow us to create our new storage pool. There's our option for BTRFS, and this is what we're going to need for our Windows Server installation. We click next and move forward to the completion of the volume creation. And there you go, our volume is listed here on screen. It's a BTRFS volume, and that makes all the difference. So if we head back now to our virtual machine creation, we can have a look and move forward. And now you can see that our BTRFS volume is now recognizable, and that's where Windows Server is going to live. We click next and move forward. From this point on, we're now going to create a virtual environment for Windows Server to live within. The NAS is still going to be our hardware, but within the hardware of the NAS, we can now create this virtual environment, this virtual playground that we're going to utilize for Windows Server. It's now going to create it in the background, and as you can see, hardware utilization has spiked dramatically. One of the most resource-intensive things you can ever do with a NAS is virtual machines. The only thing that comes close to it is widespread surveillance, but virtual machines will always use more hardware than anything else in a NAS, hence our requirements for quite powerful NASes in virtual environments. If we click Finish, we can now look at the virtual cluster that we've created. And there we go, we can step into our virtual machine if we so choose. We'll move into there now. And from here, what we're going to do is create the virtual machine that we want to utilize. So from here, we now have to select from the virtual machine tab which kind of VM we intend to use. We're going to be utilizing a Microsoft Windows VM for our server tools, but you can always create ones for a virtual via DSM from Synology, use Linux to create ones for Ubuntu, other Linux platforms, and of course Android, as well as more at the bottom for more bespoke virtual machines. For Windows Microsoft Office, go for the Microsoft Windows tab. Not Office Server, sorry. As you can see, right now, you select the virtual environment you want to utilize on that disk, and now you've got to go through some of the specifications of your Windows Server VM. So for now, we're going to call this one Windows Server 2016. Then we have to select the number of cores of our NAS that we're going to utilize in this Windows Server VM. The NAS has 4 cores, but we do have to maintain some of the performance of this NAS in the background, otherwise the VM will not function. My advice is to always leave at least a quarter or half of the available hardware of any NAS to the running of the NAS itself, and then use the rest for your virtual machines. So for now I'm going to use 2 cores for our Windows Server VM. In terms of memory, we have got 8 gig available on this device, but for now I'm going to utilize 2 gig for this virtual machine. Next, we can say what kind of video card we're utilizing, and although the device does not run on a graphics card within this NAS, we can still access it remotely via the network or the internet. From here we click Next, and now we have got to say how much storage we want to utilize in this VM. I've got around 1.8 terabytes to utilize, so for now I'm going to use 500 gigabytes. Next, it's going to ask us about utilizing the virtual machine network and what our virtual switch is going to run on. Unless you've already created multiple already, I recommend keeping it at the default VM network. Now from here, this is going to be where we set up the particulars of our particular VM environment. Now, a lot of the time Windows machines need their own drivers. When you buy a motherboard for the first time and build a PC or a server from scratch, a lot of the drivers arrive by default with that motherboard. But in the case of a virtual machine, you don't get all of those by default, and it's recommended that you download the guest tool for Synology, which hosts a bunch of tools that are ready available for your machine. Just make sure that this ISO file is ready and accessible to you for your virtual machine. It'll make more sense later. So for now, we can see the setup of our VM. I recommend at the top bar there that this is the ISO that you're going to be utilizing for your virtual machine. Do you remember those files that we downloaded earlier? Well, head over to them here and go to the software tab that I created and select the image file that we selected earlier on, that we uploaded to the NAS. Remember, if you've already created a virtual machine and you want to utilize your own image that you've created, some of these other tabs might be more appropriate, as well as utilizing pre-existing clusters and exporting and importing them effectively. Now we've selected that file, we can add our additional ISO file, but it's worth highlighting that this additional ISO file isn't always necessary. In the case of this VM, it might be advised to use the Synology VMM ISO, which has got all of those tools. For now, I'm going to leave it blank, but that is something you may wish to use for more bespoke VMs outside of Synology Microsoft Server, but not limited to. Next, we can say if we want this to load up auto start every time. I'm going to say no for now so we can engage it manually. Carrying on, we can say how we want the keyboard to be laid out and what kind of BIOS we're going to use in our virtual environment. In most cases, the default settings will be appropriate, but sometimes it's worth tinkering with these and researching a little bit in advance what you're going to utilize. Same goes for USB controllers within the virtual machine and on the NAS, because you can appropriate and assign USB ports on your NAS to the virtual machine if you so choose. So if you connect something to a USB port on the Synology NAS, it will appear within the Windows Server VM. So for now, we'll click Next and carry on forward. We can then say which users who have got NAS access can access this virtual machine and therefore can tinker with our Windows Server 2016 installation. Clicking Next, we can see a summary of all the settings we've created so far. So if you agree with all of these and you want to power up straight afterwards, click the tick there and proceed forward. And now our virtual machine is being created there in the background. We can see it there, and at the moment it's showing us the appropriated hardware and the performance of our virtual machine as we speak. The Windows machine is now running, and what we can do is head over to the network and access our VM remotely in order to see how it's going. If we click Connect, it will open up a separate tab giving us remote access to the desktop of our virtual machine. So if we get rid of that download bar, we can now see the installation of Windows Server as we would the installation of any version of Windows. We are currently looking through a kind of portal window on our network, which is our virtual access point. Remember that you don't have to access this virtual point just from a web browser. You can access it via a PC by utilizing remote desktop connection and numerous VNC remote access tools currently available for free and paid for all over the internet. But the Windows remote tool is still pretty good. You just have to enter the location from here in the URL bar into the remote desktop connection software. Chuck it in there, and particularly if you're using web-based access and remote internet access, you will need to make sure that address is spot on. For now, let's drop that tool there. We can make our way into this portal window, and as you can see, we're setting up Windows Server as we would any version of Windows. For now, we're going to leave everything in the US, even though I am based in the UK, and we're going to click Next and install our copy of Windows Server Evaluation. There'll be a few other options, as the version of Windows Server that we're utilizing is from the Evaluation Center, and it will ask us if we intend to utilize this as an evaluation version for 60 days for free, or if we have an existing license and want to install a full version. Sorry about the noise there in the background. That is my smartwatch alerting me that my network is busy. Who knew? So for now, the setup is going to begin, and if you've ever installed a copy of Windows on a PC, congratulations to you. This is going to be very, very familiar, but to the rest of you, things are pretty straightforward. Once again, if you're installing an evaluation copy, then make sure you select the right option for you. There are numerous options available, but for now, I'm going to go for the Standard Edition Desktop Experience Evaluation. I'm going to click Next, and from there, we get to move forward to some more setup options. We have to agree to terms and conditions from Microsoft, which isn't a huge surprise. And just remember, we are doing a full, fresh installation, so you will need to select that bottom option. As you can see, the system sees 500 gig of storage because that's what we allocated. And if we look back on the Synology NAS itself and open the resource monitor, we can see that not only can we still access this Synology NAS all the time, while at the same time running our virtual machine, so you can run all your backup tools and all the other Synology applications, but the utilization of your hardware will be reflected on the resource monitor. Heading back to the Windows Server user interface, we can say that we want to assign this VM, the installation, on this unallocated 500 gig capacity virtual disk. From here we click Next, and it will walk us through the installation of Windows Server on this virtual plane. I'm going to fast forward now while the VM installs in the background, and I'll fast forward to the completion of the installation of Windows Server on this Synology NAS. Okay, so the installation, the primary installation at the very least, of Windows Server 2016 on our Synology NAS has finished. It did a restart and now we're back on the desktop here on our web portal here while our Synology NAS runs there in the background. As you can see, the memory and CPU utilization has definitely creeped up, and that's definitely because 2 gig of memory has been immediately taken by this virtual machine. Right now, like any installation of a Windows-based operating system, it's just getting ready there in the background, getting a number of application and appliances set up, and there is going to be a bit of delay on screen there. Normally, I would blame this delay purely on my screen recording software, but when accessing a VM via a web browser, you will always find that the refresh rate is less than you might hope. You can play with a number of settings here on the left that allow you to change behavior of keyboards and mice, as well as lower and heighten the resolution on screen and the settings. So you can actually lower a lot of the settings so that there's less data being transmitted, and you can actually heighten the responsiveness and lower the latency of access to your Windows Server user interface. But I always recommend utilizing that remote desktop tool that I mentioned earlier on when accessing your Windows Server on a Windows environment. You will just get a better refresh rate and not utilize a web browser. And with web browsers like Chrome being incredibly resource intensive in recent years, it's definitely something I recommend. I mean, just to put into point, while this carries on there in the background, if we open up my task manager and have a look at Chrome right now, we can see that Chrome is being fantastically greedy when it comes to the memory utilization inside my device. There's a whole lot of memory being utilized just by Chrome for this VM, so you always bear that in mind. Windows Server is still continuing to get itself prepared there in the background, and now we can get it sorted out for the very first time. My username is going to be administrator, and you don't necessarily have to give yourself a username, but I'm going to anyway. And have a login, and of course I'm going to use the username password, which is super dull. I recommend you use something a bit more aggressive. Apparently it's not good enough, so we're going to go even more detailed. And carrying on, and now it's finalizing our setup. And now it's going to walk me through the installation, because now it's complete. As you can see, we've got our network access down there, and we've got Windows Server 2016 on our Synology NAS. Once you've logged into the Windows Server platform, it's just as familiar as most versions of Windows Server, and indeed Windows 10. And remember, the steps today, as I've already mentioned, can be utilized on pretty much any version of Windows Server. So that's 2019, 2016, 2012 and before. And remember, this Synology is running in the background with all of its own applications ready and accessible for everything from surveillance to multimedia needs and more. Just remember that a virtual machine has its impact on your system environment. Moreover, within the Windows Server setup, you can even do more. You can set the device up so it can be found on your local area network. Right now, this Windows Server 2016 setup is now accessible on the local area network. That means that I can now find this Windows Server on the client machine that I'm accessing this VM on. And remember to utilize tools such as Remote Desktop to access this virtual Windows Server setup in a far more user-friendly and refreshing fashion. And by refreshing, I mean the screen refresh rate. Now, once again, there are other options here on the side where you can really change what's on screen. You can make sure you've got low latency, so the screen resolution will be lowered to make sure your responsiveness is as high as possible. On top of that, you can check the settings and even move around what you can see and more. Windows Server is, a pretty good tool, and if you've never used it before but are familiar with Windows 10, it might be a better way to interact with a server with someone that's incredibly Windows compliant. Otherwise, remember that you can use the steps in today's video to do a completely fresh install of Windows Server, taking advantage of the Evaluation Center at Microsoft, use your existing copy of Windows Server and your license key if you've already got it, or export your existing Windows Server that's on a different server device and then import that image onto the Synology NAS for deployment within Virtual Machine Manager. It's as straightforward as that. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. There's loads more that can be done with virtual machines on NAS. So I'm going to try and do as many as possible with all the different NAS brands. But otherwise, I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys, and you found it useful. If you did, click a like. It really helps me make these videos and know what exactly I'm doing right and what wrong. If you've got any comments, bung them in the comments section below, and click subscribe to keep abreast of all things new in the world of network attached storage. I'll see you next time.